For decades, we've treated science as our ultimate, unquestionable arbiter of truth, right? It's objective, detached, perfectly neutral. We just kind of assume that the conclusions drawn in those pristine, sterile laboratories are universal facts about human nature. But what if they aren't? What if the foundation of all that knowledge was actually built on a massive, completely invisible blind spot? What if some of the most famous psychological conclusions that we take for granted today were shaped entirely by cultural bias? Well, in this explainer, we're cracking open the vault. We tend to picture scientists as these perfectly unbiased observers, just quietly logging data in the background. But feminist critiques of research methods have revealed a pretty stunning reality. It turns out psychology's biggest flaw wasn't a mathematical error. It was a completely invisible assumption about who was even considered normal in the first place. See, psychology claimed to be the study of the human mind, the entire human experience. But for the vast majority of its history, it was really just documenting the male experience. Half of the human population was literally treated as a footnote. And honestly, that changes absolutely everything about what we thought we knew.
Section 1. The invisible default human.
How exactly did we get to a place where the white middle-class male became the absolute default template for humanity? Just think about the absolute giants of psychology: Freud, Piaget, Kohlberg. Their massive theories of human personality, cognitive development, and moral reasoning, they were largely based on the experiences of men and boys. And when women didn't perfectly fit into these male-derived models, they weren't seen as having a valid, different experience. Nope, they were categorized as deviant or somehow less than. And this bias completely dictated what we even bothered to study in the first place. Historically, the psychological topics that were deemed pure, prestigious, and worthy of heavy funding were things like aggression, achievement, and dominance. Meanwhile, topics like affiliation, cooperation, and care, they were largely ignored, just dismissed as applied or trivial. We literally prioritized understanding how humans attack each other over how humans take care of each other, simply because of the gender bias of the researchers. And this male as default bias was so deep, it literally crossed species. I'm not kidding. According to the research, even basic biological baselines, like measuring shock sensitivity thresholds in a laboratory rats, were standardized almost exclusively on male rats. Researchers then generalized those findings to all rats and eventually to humans. This isn't just a tiny oversight, it's a massive structural flaw. Section 2. The illusion of objectivity. We really have to systematically deconstruct this myth of the perfectly detached, neutral scientist. At the end of the day, science is conducted by humans, and humans are motivated by ambition, pride, and the culture they live in, and this completely corrupts the data we actually get to see. See, scientific journals want flashy, dramatic findings. If a study finds a tiny, unexpected difference between men and women, boom, it gets published and the media runs a massive battle of the sexes headline. But what if a study finds that men and women behave exactly the same? Well, it's deemed a boring, null result, and it just gets thrown in the trash. So we are constantly fed this wildly exaggerated narrative of our differences, while our massive behavioral similarities are just hidden away in a filing cabinet somewhere. Here is a seriously mind-bending example to put that into perspective. 85%. When researchers finally reviewed the massive literature on gender differences, they found things were really not what they seemed. Take something as stereotypically gendered as rough and tumble play in kids. Studies actually show that 85% of boys and 85% of girls are virtually indistinguishable in how they play. In fact, when we look at the actual data across the board, gender usually accounts for less than 5% of the actual behavioral variance between people. Just think about how much society obsesses over innate sex differences. Yet the hard data tells us that 95% of who you are, how you act, and what you feel has absolutely nothing to do with whether you are male or female. You are far more like the opposite sex than you are different. Section 3. Flaws in the machine. So, if we are so similar, why do we still see these differences pop up in studies? Well, feminist critics point out that the bias actually hides in the methodology itself. Enter a concept called demand characteristics. Imagine walking into a sterile, high-stakes laboratory. People are smart, right? When they know they're being observed by a scientist in a lab coat, they subconsciously try to present themselves in a socially acceptable way. That artificial environment secretly cues participants on how they are supposed to act. Without even meaning to, scientists were accidentally manipulating people into performing gender stereotypes simply by observing them. And here is another major trap. In a true experiment, you randomly assign people to groups so everything is totally equal. But you obviously can't randomly assign gender. So when you compare men and women, you're doing what's called a quasi-experiment. Feminist critiques highlight that researchers often compared men and women without realizing they were placing people from completely different social, economic, and cultural starting lines onto the exact same track. So, a woman's lower score on a test of, say, influenceability might have absolutely nothing to do with her biology, and literally everything to do with a society that granted her less formal status than the man sitting right next to her.
Section 4. The language of domination.
Manipulate, control, attack, master, deceive. Believe it or not, this is the standard vocabulary of a traditional psychology lab. Critics argue that traditional science framed itself as a conqueror of nature, rather than just a respectful observer. Think about it. If your entire framework is built on attacking a problem and deceiving subjects to extract hard facts, well, you aren't just observing reality anymore. You're dominating it. And that incredibly aggressive stance inherently limits the kinds of truths you are even capable of discovering. So, what's the solution here? Enter triangulation. You can think of this as a secret cheat code unlocked by feminist critics and modern methodologists. Instead of just relying on one rigid artificial lab experiment, which is a quantitative method, you triangulate. You combine it with qualitative methods like natural observation or unstructured interviews. You use multiple, overlapping methods to capture a complete, uncorrupted picture of reality. Section 5. Better science for everyone. Because the goal of these critiques isn't to destroy science, not at all. The goal is to actively save it from itself. Modern psychology is evolving, and it is honestly thrilling to see. By abandoning the illusion of perfect neutrality, researchers are actually creating vastly superior data. They're rigorously acknowledging their own biases right there in the reports. They're mixing research methods. They're getting out of those sterile labs to observe people in their natural environments, where they actually act normally. And they are using collaborative focus groups, treating participants not as subjects to be manipulated, but as real partners in discovering the truth. I want to leave you with this really profound realization from the source text. Objectivity is considered a hallmark of science, but it is perhaps most accurately viewed as a retrospective virtue. See, true objectivity isn't about pretending you don't have a perspective. It's about rigorously examining your biases and designing methods that actually account for them. Only when we stop pretending to be invisible observers can we finally start seeing the complete picture of what it means to be human. So think about that the next time you read a headline claiming a new scientific fact. Who asked the question, and who were they looking at?